1998, Death released their final album, The Sign of Perseverance. And this is probably the most interesting one to talk about. There's a lot of rumors that say Chuck didn't really want to have to make this album because he wrote a lot of it during the same time he wrote his new project that he really wanted to do, Control Denied, like a progressive power metal band. But he wrote this album as well, and it kind of felt like it was just leftovers of that album, and a lot of people in the band stated that they were just kind of leftovers from that album. And the reason for that being is that musically, Control Denied is not that much similar to, like, even Symbolic. I mean, songs like Zero Tolerance are kind of similar, but for the most part, that album was actually pretty heavy with, like, a technical edge, kind of like Human, and individual thought patterns. But this album sounds nothing musically like that. Save a couple moments, it just sounds like musically progressive metal. Now the performances aren't even really that much death metal either, especially the drumming, which is my least favorite part of the album. Now, look, Richard Christie's a really, really good progressive drummer, but he does not work at all with this band or on this album. He just tries way too hard and like does way too many fills all over the place that just sound wrong and out of place. And then his drums just sound weird. Like, it sounds like he has a lot of splash cymbals. Like, his kit just sounds fucking weird. The guitars just sound very high pitched, and they don't sound well for death metal at all. I don't really like the rest of the lineup either. I don't like Shannon Hamm that much. I don't like Scott Clendon or whatever his name is on bass. Everyone's just kind of boring to me. And you can really tell that Chuck was trying to turn death and death metal upside down with this, because it's just so fucking different every single way. I mean, even the goddamn logo changed. The Death's head is no longer on the H. They don't have the cobwebs or anything. The only thing that's really stayed is Death's sight. I mean, they even re-inverted the cross that's normal side up. And to most people, the biggest offense of this album, and my final point, that this album really isn't death metal, it's just kind of like extreme metal or progressive extreme metal, is that Chuck's vocals aren't even death metal. Instead of doing his normal mid-range growl, even that he did on like Symbolic, which is still a death growl, his extreme vocal on this album is just screaming. His singing is just high-pitched screaming with like really blood-curdled guttural vocals that you would hear on like some power black metal shit like Cradle of Filth and stuff like that. So to be honest, I don't think this album is death metal. It's just progressive metal or extreme metal. Well, I mean, I guess most progressive metal nowadays is extreme, so it's just progressive metal. Let's be honest with ourselves. Get the cat out of the bag, get the cock out of the pants. This album is fucking extreme metal or prog metal, but it is not death metal at all. So a lot of the things work against this album. Like, I have to take points away just for the fact that so many bad things are going on in this album. The performances, production. Chuck fucking didn't want to do death. He said that he wanted Symbolic for the last album, and they kind of forced him into making another album. So we have The Sign of Perseverance. Came out in '98, and the artwork, there's two different versions. The original looks like a weird CGI hunk of shit, and then the new one, which is kind of like the same thing but different, and it's more of like a painting, is a lot better. It shows a bunch of people climbing a mountain in what looks like the underworld, but the mountain is actually Death's hood, which I think is pretty cool. Now, before we get into the songs, I do want to state that for me and a lot of people, this is actually the first death metal album we heard, and I really loved the album. It was like a 10 out of 10 for me. I absolutely loved it. But because of me getting into this album first and thinking this is what death metal and extreme metal is about, I couldn't even get into really Death's other albums. It took me forever just to even get into Symbolic, let alone like the early shit like Leprosy or Spiritual Healing. As weird as that sounds, I couldn't really even get into Death's other music because of this album. And I couldn't get into other death metal either. I except for maybe Opeth, because that's kind of the same progressive metal style. But it was obscuring my own view of death metal, and that's my biggest fucking problem with this album. My biggest fucking gripe with it is that it obscured and ruined my view of death metal for the longest time. I couldn't get into it because it wasn't this album. Well, now that I love death metal, I say, fuck you, Sound of Perseverance. You're not death metal. You're progressive metal. I'm just kidding, I'm not that mad at the album, but it did really fuck up my view of like old school death metal and stuff like that. And I'm almost certain that does the same for a lot of people, because I see a lot of people that rank this album as one of the best death metal albums, and they don't really like death metal that much. That's why I keep saying start with Leprosy or Spiritual Healing, because that's really what death metal's about. Or even Human. This is not what death metal's about, because it's not fucking death metal. So even though everything is working against this album, the music is actually still pretty decent for the most part. There's still some really good songs on it that have still held up, even though I've had such drastic different opinion on this album. I've had a second opinion, if you will, of this album. Scavenger of Human Sorrow is still a badass song. It has Richard Christie's weird, annoying drumming all over it and screaming all over it, but it's still awesome because the music is amazing. Now, Bite the Pain, fucking biggest problem with this album. I keep saying that. There's just more problems with this big fucking album. The songs are like really long and like trying to be technical and progressive, but like only one riff in each of these songs, or most of these songs, are even good. This is the biggest fucking offender. This song has a kind of boring intro. It's like, okay, as long as you redeem yourself. It goes into one of the most badass death metal riffs. Here we're talking. One of the few death metal riffs in the whole album. It's badass, and then it just goes into boring shit throughout the rest of the song, trying to be proggy and intellectual and shit. And it's fucking awful. Spirit Crush is a pretty good song, but it's not that great, and it kind of gets less good the more I hear it, because the chorus is really boring, the song's kind of too long. Some of the breakdowns are kind of pointless and drag on, and it should have been a single, to be honest, because it's considered a classic on this album, and I don't know why they weren't doing more music videos and shit for the band at this time, but this should have been like a single. Story to Tell is really boring, but I do admit that the chorus part with like the crazy lead melody is pretty badass. The rest of the song is very boring and monotonous, very long. Flesh and the Power It Holds is way too long, and the main riff, the really good riff that everyone likes, it's basically just symbolic. The riff to that, but really fast. I'll admit that riff's pretty badass, and the song for the most part's okay, but it's just way too goddamn long. But I do really like the middle part where it slows down and has Chuck play a really evil sounding solo. But the rest of the song's so boring, it didn't need to be 8 minutes at all. Voice of the Soul is actually pretty cool. It has a lot of interweaving like acoustic melodies and lead guitar duets that are actually pretty fucking cool. I do really like that song. To Forgive is to Suffer is a prog metal song through and through, and it's still pretty decent actually. I actually really like the main riff of this song. It's pretty melodic, and there's a lot of really good melodies all over it, and the riff transitions are really nice. One of the shorter ones that's actually not bad, and then A Moment of Clarity is fucking pure awfulness. It's completely unorganized and random. It reminds me of Perennial Quest. And the chorus is just a muddlefuck of irritation, of screaming and pig squealing guitars. And the song is way too goddamn long. Why does it need to be 7 minutes? Then we get to Painkiller, the first song I heard from the band, and it's not even an original. Painkiller, the cover, is actually kind of cool in some ways. It had to be in the right mood for it. Otherwise, like, I'll hate the song, or I'll kind of like it. And a lot of people do think that this is better than the Judas Priest version, which I completely disagree with. So that's kind of why I have sort of a problem with it, because I don't like covers that aren't better than the original, and this one isn't better than the original. But let's talk about Chuck's death. Now, Chuck is considered the godfather of death metal and did push the boundaries of extreme metal and even extreme prog metal, because this isn't death metal, but yet he did so much for extreme metal. And a lot of people did think that after experimenting with Control Denied that Chuck would probably return to death. He'd probably go for like some more old school styles again, and really start pumping out some badass stuff after recharging his batteries. But Chuck wasn't able to do that because in the early 2000s, Chuck was diagnosed with cancer and had a brain tumor, and they kept trying to treat him. They even had like charity events for him and stuff. Like a lot of people, even famous musicians and stuff, donated to his cause, and it was helping. But then he got pneumonia from the sickness, and that killed him. Not even the cancer, just the sheer amount of treatment killed him. It's really sad because he was such a legend. He could have done more and even improved his own band and come back with some stuff that was really cool. Even if it was just like this, it would have been cool to see him do more Sound of Perseverances, but he'll never be able to do that. However, former members of the band have actually got together to do a bunch of tours as a tribute for Death and as the band Death. And I still think they're touring. I think they're doing another tour soon. I highly recommend you go see them because they still put on a hell of a show even though Chuck's not there. So that's Death, and that's the Sound of Perseverance. And I'm going to give this album a 6 out of 10.